Again, I'm not taking a position here. I'm not saying, hey, like, do gematria to your heart's content. I'm just bringing it up because in this instance, 666, it's very likely that we do have gematria because John tells us, here's a number. You have to figure out its meaning. It's the number of a man. Okay, the mystery isn't the number because he gives you that. The mystery is, what does it stand for? What does it mean? Now, gematria is like a subset of numerology. Gematria was very common in Jewish and Christian circles and other circles, but especially Jewish and Christian, because not all languages do this. So a lot of languages will have symbols for certain numbers, units of numbering, either the ones and the tens and the hundreds and the thousands and whatever. Hebrew and Greek do not have, as a normal course of things, a set of signs for numbers. They have consonants do double duty. So in the case of Hebrew, your first 9 consonants are numbers 1 through 9. So if I'm a scribe and I'm writing along and I want to say how old somebody is, I can either write out the number longhand like we would do, 388, use the whole words. But if I wanted to just represent the number, I would pick certain consonants. The one that stood for 300, one that stood for 10, one that stood for 8, that kind of thing. So that lends itself to numbers having meanings, because when you have a number and you convert it to its consonants, in a lot of cases you have a meaning. Or what's often done is whatever the consonants are, that'll become a word, like a proper name or something. It just becomes its own word, and then that word, that new word put into the language, will stand for that number. People will just memorize it that way. So in this case, there are scholars who consider that 666 might have a gematria meaning, a gematria referent. So with that preface, we have here 666. Now this number in both Jewish and again Christian circles was considered inferior to God because John said it was human, and also because the addition of the number, again, I'm going to limit this to the Greek stuff primarily because Revelation is written in Greek. This number 666 was less than the name Jesus, which would be Jesus. When you plug the numbers in for that equaled 888. And so that's why Jesus is known in certain texts as the fullness of the Ogdod. The Ogdod is a word for 8, and he's the fullness of 8s, because his number means 888. So some of these titles for Jesus and other biblical characters that have these weird, like, what in the world are they talking about? Well, in a lot of cases they're talking about the number that their name turns into. It's like a shorthand. So 666 was less than Jesus, so it's inferior to Christ, and also because it's a number of a man, and Christ is the God-man, so that puts him above. And so the beast could be viewed, certainly as a man and also as a pseudo-Christ, because there's a relationship between the 3 6s and the 3 8s that I'll show you in a moment. And so somehow the two identities, the two names are linked, one being superior to the other. We're not going to do anything with Jesus Christos, not much anyway. You take those two words and put them into their numbers, and that number is 1480. Now, it just so happens, before I put that up, that in Jewish and Greek esoteric tradition and numerology, they believe that each celestial body, and they would use the word planets, and they would include the sun in the planets because, again, they had a geocentric view of the universe. So the sun was just another one of these things that orbit, around the Earth. They believe that each one possessed a spirit and an intelligence, or was guided by a spirit and an intelligence. This goes back to the really old belief that celestial bodies were living beings because they moved. So this is why you get an overlap of divine being terminology, Elohim, with terms like Kokavim, the stars, heavenly hosts, that kind of thing. There was this presumed relationship. The name of this spirit or intelligence was derived from the numbers of that celestial body's magic square. Now, what the magic square was you took the first 36 numbers and you arranged them in rows so that it's kind of like Sudoku. By virtue of the arrangement, each row, horizontally, vertically, and diagonally, all added up to the same number. And once you were able to figure that out, that became known as the magic square, because it like works in every direction. And so each body had its own sort of magic square. And in this case, 666 reflects the magic square of the sun. Because every row, this way, this way, this way, and this way, adds up to 111, and there are 6 of them. So you do the math, 666. Now, if we take 111 and take each one of these, 111, the sum, and put that into Hebrew, that produces the name Nakiel. That becomes sort of the code name for the number 111. Looks like that. I've excerpted a little bit from this book, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Ancient Cosmology and Early Christian Symbolism. I do not recommend this book for baby Christians. Fiedler is a Gnostic. Okay, he's a scholar. He has a PhD. He's in some other, I can't remember what field it is, but he's a Gnostic, and so it would be very easy to dive into this book and come out thinking all sorts of weird kinds of thoughts. Okay, but nevertheless, he has a really good handle on early Christian symbolism, because that's kind of what Gnostics do. And I want you to notice some of the commentary. Number 666. Again, the magic square of the sun, and he talks about the grid here. The value of the entire square is therefore 666. And he talks about Nakiel. There's a thing called that the intelligence of the sun is Nakiel. The spirit of the sun is Sorath. Okay, it has a different spelling. So you get these two names that are associated with the sun. 888, of course, Jesus was the S-O-N and the S-S-U-N of early Christians. In fact, in early Christian, in any sort of astro-theological stuff, because Yahweh in the Old Testament is referred to as the sun, those sun and shield passages. And that would be because it's the biggest, brightest celestial body. And if we assume all the celestial bodies are actually, like living entities or powered by them, his is the biggest. Again, it's just very simple logic, simple analogy. And so Jesus replaces that for the early church because he is the God-man. Let's go over here. Again, 888, the plenitude of the Ogdoads and that sort of thing. Now, he gets into here about the stoicheia, which naturally relates to this. But I want to focus on, let's see here. The name Jesus, 888, is a perfect name encompassing the whole of creation and is reflected in the perfection of the 24 letters of the classical Greek alphabet, which numerically contains 8 letters denoting hundreds, 8 denoting tens, 8 denoting the ones, the units. And so to the Greeks, that 888 was special for that reason. Jesus is therefore Alpha and Omega because it's the first letter of the Greek alphabet and the last. And the fact that you can divide the 24 letters into 3 precise units of 8, 888 again, alpha, omega, 888. If you actually take alpha and omega, though, that number's 801. And this is, I mentioned this yesterday about the dove, peristera. If you plug in the numbers here, it's 801. So a lot of people think that's why we have the dove image in the baptism passage. And then there's also the Noah, the Nuach rest connection. But it's another way of saying this is the alpha and omega. One more thing here, I think 1 or 2 more slides, 2 more. So this is the magic square of the sun. If we take the numbers, this diagonal and this diagonal, which is the sign of what? This is the letter chi, the first word in Christos, which became a cross symbol. Okay, if you add these, you get 2 rows of 111, and that's 222, added to 666 equal 888. And so this became symbology for the superiority of Christ over whoever bears the number of the beast. Okay, again, it's just a way to cryptically telegraph where you're at theologically. Jesus is the superior number. This other number is inferior. He's a pseudo-Christ. Now, all this goes in interesting places. I threw this in because some of you might, symbols might be important depending on, again, what you're doing, what you're working with. But there are a whole bunch of these, and I want to show you this one. Nachiel, again, is this 111. And so, again, in terms of Hebrew gematria, here are your numerical values for the name. And it just so happens that if you take the zeros off, at least to the 50, you have the 5, and there's the 10, the 20, the 3, and the 1. People who did gematria would play with the square like this. And then when they had a configuration of numbers that made sense to them in a reconstruction, they would connect them with lines, and then the symbol became the code for the number and the code for the name. So there are just hundreds of these, because that's what they're doing. So you might come across a symbol. I don't have a big collection of these, but Fiddler's book has several of them, but it's not hard to find, sort of an assembly of these. So if you're coming across symbols, I might be able to find something interesting for you. What's the connection? What Greco-Roman deity was associated with the sun as the ruler of other deities? That would be Zeus. What was Zeus's parentage? What was he? Oh, come on, give me a cursor here. Zeus was one of the Titans. And I've colorized some things in DDD for you. Just go through this. In a strict sense, Titans is the collective name of only 6 of the sons of the original greater gods, sky, heaven and earth, Uranus and Gaia, whose 6 sisters and wives were also called Titanesses. Most important couple was Kronos and Rhea, who became parents of Zeus. The Greek name Titans occurs in the geographical name Valley of the Titans in the Septuagint. If you look this up in the Hebrew Bible or your English translation, can you guess what it's called? It's not the Valley of the Titans, because Titan is Greek. It's the Valley of the Rephaim. So again, now you have a conceptual link between the Rephaim, the Titans, Zeus, back to 666. This is what Irenaeus was tracking on. When Irenaeus, I have just a little bit of this, a word play on Titanos in the facade as part of the story. But there's actually more to it than just the name. Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, discusses 666 and the different possible interpretations. And he doesn't necessarily endorse this, but he lets you know he kind of likes it. You know, to him, there's some coherence to it because the Titans were also tyrants, you know, and that's sort of the picture of the Antichrist in Revelation and whatnot. Let's go down here a little bit. I think I have one other, yeah. So, let's see here. Titan, again, in Greco-Roman thinking, and of course you have, if it's Greco-Roman, you have this connection to the Septuagint, which connects you to the Old Testament. Most of the children of Uranus and Gaia were of gigantic stature. Again, so Titans is still, in a wider sense, became more or less associated with giants and naturally the evil powers. The Titan, I always mess this up. Titanomachy, this is the battle, the wars of the giants that are described in Greek, Greek mythology. And the Gigantomachy really, goes into this a little more. And so down here you have this reference to the valley of the Rephaim, the valley of the giants, and sometimes you'll actually have the word transliterated in the Septuagint, or just as giant. And of course this goes into stuff we know about the sons of God and whatnot. And he says down here, the name is not found as such in the writings of the New Testament, but may be hidden in the 666, in the number of the beast, so on and so forth. Again, there's the math equivalent. So I wanted you to see that, so that you know it's not just something off somebody's website. There are actually scholars who look at this and essentially say it's kind of worth thinking about. I mean, this might be the point of the number. And so you say, well, what would the point be? Well, in some way, the number of the beast might be a clue or a telegraphing, some sort of foreboding that whoever the Antichrist figure is, there is some connection between him and the Rephaim and or, again, Nephilim or something like that. There might be some association. Now, beyond that, you don't really know what the association is. Again, in Irenaeus' view, it referred to at least being a tyrant, but it brings up the question of this sort of quasi-divine nature. And you could have someone come along and just claim to be a God-man and be able to do amazing things, or even more literally than that, you could have some sort of incarnation that would be able to pull that off. Again, all of that is speculation, and it's all built off the assumption that 666 is gematria that works in that direction that I just showed you. I don't know that it does, and neither does anybody else, but it was something that church fathers considered, and it's something that scholars still write about, and at least throw into the mix as far as an option. So I want to start with common positions and assumptions, and then their presumed basis, and then talk about the problems. So that's the pattern we'll use. And eventually, the slide presentation after this, I'm going to try to give you some points of clarity that I think we can be pretty certain about, and then add a few divine counsel tidbits, divine counsel bacon bits, I guess, over the top of this, that we'll look at certain eschatological topics in light of some of the divine counsel stuff in the Old Testament. And we may, I may speculate a little bit here and there for you, but I'd probably keep this to a minimum, may not do it at all. Positions and assumptions. There's going to be a future 1,000-year kingdom. National Israel has a prophetic future. The Jerusalem temple will be rebuilt. There will be a rapture. Okay, all of those things are positions people take, and they are based on certain assumptions. Now, whether you realize it or not, these things are based on your interpretation of the promises given to Abraham, the promises given to David, 70 weeks of Daniel, again, how you presume that should be interpreted, and the flow of the book of Revelation. And whatever you mean by imminence, we believe the Bible teaches imminence. Jesus could come back right now. Well, what is imminence anyway? Prophetic literalism. What is literalism? And your assumption that second coming passages, when they don't all have the same wording, they must be different events. That's an assumption. There's nothing like there's like no footnote in the original, Hebrew and Greek that says, footnote. When passages disagree in wording, keep them separate. There's nothing like that. You just guess that's what you're supposed to do. Well, when it comes to these things, especially the promises to Abraham, and to some extent promises to David, there the presumption is usually this is an unconditional covenant. It doesn't matter what national Israel did or does. God will give them the land. So even though they sinned and went into exile, and God brought them back, but they were still beat up by every, two-bit and, legitimate empire that came along. Even though they were scattered and, they didn't have a nation until 1948. What happened in 1948 must be a fulfillment of this because the covenant is unconditional. But those are all assumptions. The other side will say either they sinned it away and the church inherited the promises because Israel failed, or they did get it. Remember the map yesterday about the kingdom of David, the kingdom of Solomon? They did inherit it, so why are you looking for anything else? What's this national future of Israel thing going on? Again, that's where the arguments are going to be. So you can defend either view. Let's look at the Abrahamic promises. Conditional or unconditional? Unilateral or bilateral? Are they dependent on obedience or not? Here is the first one we get, Genesis 12. Okay. Go from your country, I'll show you a land, I'll make of you a great nation, bless you, make your name great, so that you'll be a blessing. Again, so we have this multiplication of the population. We have a land in here. I will bless those who bless you. And him who dishonors you I will curse, so that through you, all families of the earth will be blessed. Right here, you read this. I don't see any conditions there. Looks unconditional. Genesis 15, 5 through 18. Again, look toward the heaven, number the stars if you're able to number them. So shall your offspring be. To your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. We looked at that yesterday. And then there's this covenant ceremony where Abraham falls into a deep sleep, and the animals that he took and he split in half and he laid them side by side, and then the presence of God passes through. Again, looks pretty one-sided, looks pretty unilateral or unconditional. And it does. But then you get to Genesis 17. Same guy, Abram, same God, Yahweh. Same conversation continues. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. Well, now it sounds like I'm obligated in some way. Be blameless so that I may make my covenant between me and you and multiply you greatly. Yeah, this is the wording of the previous covenant. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan. That's clearly conditional language. Clearly. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout your generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep. I mean, how many times does he have to say it? Every male among you shall be circumcised. Now, this is pre-Sinai, so the fundamental obligation here is circumcision, which was a sign of your entry into the covenant, your agreement to be part of this arrangement. Because when we get to Sinai, there's going to be a whole lot of other things that are connected to possession of the land. And then it most fundamentally, along with circumcision, will be love the Lord thy God, him only shall you worship, that sort of thing. Then the focus becomes loyalty to Yahweh as the lone object of worship. Okay, do not go into idolatry. Genesis 22, again, this is the Abraham and Isaac, offering thing. We get down to the end here. In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, for those of you out there in internet land, and of course for those of you here, here's the point. When God tells Abraham to offer Isaac to test his loyalty, his faith, Abraham could not just say, I don't feel like doing that. That's just kind of scary. I think I'll skip that. Because I know I'll still get the land. I'll still have a great family. I'll still have a great name. I'll still be a blessing because God unilaterally promised that to me with no obligations. Okay? No. That's specifically denied here. Okay? And in the rest of the story. Deuteronomy 4, we've actually looked at these verses before, but I threw them back in here. Again, this is idolatry right here. If you act corruptly by making a carved image in the form of anything, just backtrack a little bit. You got to understand what Deuteronomy is. Almost the entire book is 3 or 4 sermons of Moses when they're back, on the cusp of going back into the land. That's why it's called Deuteronomy, because they wander around for 40 years. They get back to where they started from, and Moses says, "Okay, there's a new generation around here now. Most of the old generation has died off because of the sin back, in Numbers 13. So let's go over the law. Let's rehearse that, shall we?" And he goes through these long sermons, and he re-gives the law. Okay? There are changes between Deuteronomy and Exodus because they reflect a different time and different circumstances going into the land as opposed to just being a wandering people. So there's stuff like that. But it's the law. And in this book, this is where you get clear, repeatedly, connections between being loyal to God and being in the land. Because if you're disloyal, the Lord will scatter you among all the peoples, and you'll be left few in number among the nations, where the Lord will drive you out. I'll kick you out of the land if you're not loyal to me. It's just over and over and over and over again in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 5, be careful to do therefore as the Lord your God has commanded, that you may live long in the land that you shall possess. If we're going to go in, if you want to stay there, you better be loyal to me. Go ahead.
How did, in the book of Hebrews, it says that, the writer says that Abraham knew that even if he went through with the sacrifice, that God could raise his son from the dead. How does the writer to Hebrews know that that's the way Abraham was, that kind of faith or that kind of thinking?
I think that's based on subtle language in the Abraham and Isaac story, where Abraham takes Isaac, and they have the wood there with them, and he says to his servant, I and the child will go to worship, and we shall return. Just things like that. Abraham knows he's going to go offer Isaac because he's going to obey God. He doesn't understand it, doesn't like it. He's going to obey God. But he says there, we'll both be coming back. So it's a little hint that, again, it's not that Abraham exactly knew how this would happen, but he believed that God could actually do that. And so he was going to go through with it. And I think that's what the writer of Hebrews picks up on. Yes.
Now, Abraham comes out of a pagan background. At that time period, there was child sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Did he think somehow that, well, maybe this new deity has chosen me, I've embraced him, that somehow he's similar to these other ones in this regard?
I'm extraordinarily skeptical of that, because you're not going to find child sacrifice in Babylon. You're also, and I say Babylon because most people think that Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham comes from, is in Babylonia. I don't. But there's another Ur, Ura, in Syria, near Haran, which is where Abraham's relatives are. Well, who'd have thought that? But they didn't practice it in Syria either. I mean, child sacrifice, we think that this was ubiquitous, all over the ancient world. I don't want to say it was uncommon, but everybody didn't do it. There were, people groups that did this regularly, but that doesn't mean everyone did it. And to my knowledge, I don't know of any evidence that it would have been practiced by Abraham's Semitic relatives, or certainly if you take a Babylonian location there. So I don't think there's any connection there at all. But Deuteronomy 6, again, this is the greatest commandment. Okay, to love the Lord thy God. Again, in verses 4 and 5, when we get to down here to verses 16 and so, it's the same thing. Obey to avoid being pushed out of the land. The whole commandment I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply. You got to look at these terms. These are right out of the covenant. Okay, this is not, again, accidental language. Exodus 23, again, we have the borders of the land. We saw this yesterday. Lay up these words of mine, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers. If you're careful to do this, everything will be great. Again, you get the borders of the land down here. Leviticus 26 we saw yesterday. Keep my Sabbaths, reverence my sanctuary. Again, all these things, don't make idols. They're about the exclusive worship of Yahweh. That's the big issue, over and over and over again. And that's linked to dwelling securely in the land and God's presence in the land among them. In Leviticus 26, if in spite of all this you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you in fury, and myself I will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. We'll actually come back to that verse. Let's just skip through. And you saw this graphic yesterday, again, about whether the land is fulfilled or not. So, let's stay here. The issue is, again, based upon certain assumptions of how the covenants work, how this covenant works. We'll get to the other one in a moment. Based upon certain assumptions, people will conclude certain things about a national future for Israel and, of course, a millennial kingdom. Now, you say, well, they went into exile and they were brought back. Yes, they were. God finally gets to the point when they're on the verge of exile that he says to Jeremiah, I want you to go tell the people about a new covenant. We're going to make a new covenant with you. Remember Jeremiah 31. And in that covenant, God basically says, this is the Heiser paraphrase version, you people are perpetual screw-ups. And so what I'm going to do, is I'm going to change your heart. I'm going to send my spirit. I'm going to change your heart. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that there will always be somebody out there who believes. There will always be a remnant. Because I'm going to win. I'm going to get this done. I will live on earth with men, with my family. I'm going to do all these things. Of course, that, goes into play again at Pentecost, okay, the whole indwelling of the Spirit, where now we are the temples and all this sort of thing. It shows that the covenants are conditional, and when people are disloyal and disobey and sin, God hates that. You know, he doesn't want that to be the case, but you are free to choose to be disloyal. But I just want you to know, I will have a people. And if I need to step in, and again, always make sure there's a remnant, I'm going to do it. Okay, I will not surrender what is mine. You know, even again, allowing you to be free. I will not surrender what is mine. Go ahead.
So by making the new covenant there in Jeremiah 31, he's saying there's a defect in the old covenant.
He's saying there's a defect in people.
Right.
Right? If we want to say there's a, you could say, well, there's a defect in this whole idea, God. What are you doing trusting humanity? God would say, yeah, you're right. They're perpetual screw-ups, but I love them.
This has something to do like with the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament. It came and went upon people. Now
There-
we have
there-
indwelling
There
spirit.
is, I will say that this way, because that is really a difficult subject. Because if we really, I'll give you an example. It's very clear in the Old Testament that the Spirit comes and goes. Okay, that language is all over the place. The Spirit comes upon people and arrests people to do a specific task, whether it's build the tabernacle furniture or be king or be a prophet or whatever. And the Spirit moves from person to person. Again, it's an enablement ministry. So people have concluded, they've concluded from that there was no permanency at all in the Spirit's interaction with people in the Old Testament. I don't really think that's the case, because if it's true that no one can be righteous without the assistance of the Spirit, and Paul's kind of clear on that, if that's true, then the righteous people in the Old Testament needed the Spirit too. Now, having said that, there is a difference between what the Spirit does and why in the new that was not an issue in the old. Okay, so there is something new about the new covenant. But to get into that, I will lose another hour. But I say it that way again to telegraph to people listening. Yes, there's something new going on here, and it does have to do with creating this circumcision neutral thing we call the church, again, which Paul calls the mystery. It does have to do with making sure there's always a remnant, and things like this. But I don't want to divorce that from the need, even in the Old Testament, for people to have the assistance of the Spirit to walk with God. That's all I'm trying to say. Now you look at the borders here, you say, well, I know my view. Okay, I don't really care about all those conditions. Thanks for showing those to me now. That's not going to rattle my cage. Well, great, whatever. If you're honest, you got to deal with it. You got to deal with it, and you can fall back to the remnant idea. That's okay. That's in the Bible too, Jeremiah 31. And you can link the remnant idea to the borders of the land. Wonderful. For those of among us that would say, again, this is more the Reformed crowd and the amillennial crowd. That's it, Mike. Give it to them. We're the ones that always believed in the conditionality of the covenants, and that it was handed to the church, and the church inherits everything. Yeah, I'm loving this. Well, I'll give you something to hate now. See this little strip right here? The stuff that wasn't under David and Solomon's control. Depending on which boundary list you use for the land, Israel didn't get the land. Now this is a little map. You'd have to, again, you can look at it when you get the slides. You go down here and it'll tell you what the different set of lines are. There are basically 3 sets of border parameters for the land in the Old Testament. So the question is, which one matters? Which one should I attach to the covenants? And one set will say, well, the ones that are actually in Genesis and Exodus, because that's when the covenants were given. Great. These are the ones that mattered when they actually took it. And if you're going by these, they didn't get the land. They never got it, all of it. They got most of it, but they never got all of it. And you can even make an argument based on Judges and parts of Joshua and the end of the beginning of Judges, that even what it looks like was taken, sort of kind of wasn't, because there's still Canaanites living in their midst. Okay, so like, what's your definition of conquest? What's your definition of take the land? Because if you're the amillennialist and you're going to argue this, you got to answer those questions. You have to come up with a coherent answer. It's probably easier to argue that they didn't get the land, they just sinned it away. God just punished them and gave it to the church. That's probably your easier argument. Of course, then you have to deal with all those passages that we just went through, and I don't think I repeat them here. Oh yeah, I do this one, Leviticus 26. All of those passages that I showed you, though, as clear as they are about the conditionality, they all have something like this. If they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, then I'm going to remember my covenant. Now okay, they sinned it away, but God said, I'll remember my covenant. He did bring them back to the land. And yeah, they weren't independent until 1948. We understand that. But if I'm speaking to a millennialist, you don't want to hear anything about 1948 anyway. So, does 1948 matter in terms of the Bible, in terms of biblical prophecy? And you get people really divided, on this issue. And it works its way into current political positions. How friendly do we need to be to Israel and all that kind of stuff? So the real issue, though, behind all those issues, the real issue is, what does it mean that God remembers his covenant with respect to Israel? Does that mean that the remembrance happened in 1948? That was the clue. That was the evidence that God remembered his covenant. And of course, then you're going to link that to a future for national Israel, and we need to be, good to Israel, or we'll be cursed, and all this stuff. Or does the remembrance mean the church? Or both? I mean, you actually have three choices there. Which one's right? I don't know. Okay, I'm just telling you that your position, your prophetic positions are not self-evident. You don't just open a Bible and out pops your position on eschatology. Don't tell me the Bible says so. The Bible says all this too. Okay, the Bible doesn't come with a set of instructions. It doesn't come with a hermeneutical guide. Okay, this is your hermeneutical guide. And you say, well, Mike, it's not just my brain, it's the Spirit. Well, that's wonderful. That's just great, because what that means is that you're the godly one. You're the one led by the Spirit, and those other people aren't. Okay, that's part of the reason why the church is in so much trouble. Okay, because we attach godliness and spirit-ledness, and isn't that a butchery of the English language? Spirit-ledness to our position on eschatology. That somehow the Spirit cleared up the ambiguity for me. I must be special. I must be walking with God. I don't know what's wrong with these other people. They're so dense, the Spirit can't reach them. Or else they'd believe in a pre-trib rapture. Come on. You just need to get real. You need to I would say you need to understand that prophecy is deliberately cryptic. Okay, there's a reason for that. And you need to just let God know what's going to go on. Let God know what the right interpretation is. Sure, take a position, enjoy it, think about it, but be charitable to other positions. Okay, don't assign a special level of spirituality to you because you hold a certain position. That's just ridiculous. That is as arrogant as the scholar, okay, who assigns complete validity to a position because he or she holds it. Okay, it's just as arrogant. Go ahead.
In Acts, when I think it's the angel comes to Cornelius and says, your gifts and your offerings your prayers have come up before God as a memorial.
Mhm.
Do you have any sense as to how that happens? Like, how does God, you know, consider our prayers, our gifts, and then, I think I'll do something for this righteous person?
Well, I think the imagery is for us. I mean, God doesn't need visible images. He doesn't need things like that to see and hear. So I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
I'm not either, but
uh, you know, ultimately God knows and sees and hears, the heart. So these prayers being offered, um, if that's the point, in the Old Testament, they would use incense as imagery, as a symbolic, visible thing for the people, to remind the people that down here on earth we're trying to reach, God, in the way God wants us to do that. So there were visible reminders like that. They also used incense because when you slaughter lots of animals, it stinks. So there was a practical use of incense as well. But I think those sorts of things are incidental to God and more important, for us. That's why he gives them. Let me muddy the waters even more. Okay, remember Leviticus 26? Okay, if they confess, I'll remember my covenant. Okay. I will make my dwelling among them. My soul shall not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God. You shall be my people. And of course, that was conditioned on loyalty to Yahweh. And then, but I will, for their sake, remember the covenant with their forefathers. That's actually quoted in the Old Testament or the New Testament. What accord has Christ with Belial? What portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Okay. In other words, God dwelling among his people, that happens in us. And we are corporately known as the church, the body of Christ. And he quotes, as soon as Paul says this, he quotes this stuff over here. I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Okay, so now we're going after the dispensational crowd. If you want, again, to talk about the temple out there, the temple needs to be reviewed. We need a temple. And look, a temple in the land. God's going to dwell in the land. He's going to remember the covenant. Right there. Okay, you got to deal with that. Paul knew that passage too. And he quoted it in conjunction with the church. So, what are we going to do with that? And then I remember my covenant. Again, more. Luke 1. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people, and he has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. It's obviously Jesus. As he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show the mercy promised to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father Abraham, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear. So this remembering the covenant idea is connected to Jesus, okay, who is raised up. Now, does that refer to the resurrection, or just does it refer to the fact that Jesus came? It's incidental, because this is the first coming that Luke's writing about, not the second. Again, you got to deal with that. I'm just going through things you have to deal with, no matter what your view is. Promises to David. Is Jesus reigning or not? Here is the Davidic covenant. God comes to... God tells David, again through the prophet, when your days are fulfilled, you lie down with your fathers. I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, build a house for my name, establish the throne of his kingdom forever. The obvious immediate reference there is Solomon. But the language, is malleable as far as a dynasty, a succession. I shall be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him, so on and so forth. But my steadfast love will not depart from him as I took it from Saul. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. This is the covenant that establishes the legitimacy of only the line of David to be king. Only someone from the line of David. Acts 2:30 references this covenant. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with him, or with an oath to him, that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses, being therefore exalted at the right hand of God, so on and so forth. Do you see what he's doing here? He's connecting the resurrection of Christ with the Davidic covenant. Now here's the question. Again, if you're a dispensationalist, it's like, the Lord has to come back, and everybody agrees on that point. Thankfully, there's something everybody agrees on. But when he comes back, he sets up a 1,000-year kingdom, because we need that, because of the Davidic covenant. We have to have a king. We have to have a kingdom on earth, and the king is Jesus, and we're going to see this happen, right on earth and before our eyes. Well, again, we might, but the other side would refer to this and say, well, the kingdom is now, and that's all there is. I mean, this kingdom is the kingdom, and they'll reference verses like this. Now, I have different reasons other than the millennium passage in Revelation 20 for thinking that I will put it this way, there will be earthly rule on earth. Okay, hence it's earthly. But my reasons are different. My reasons are about reclaiming the nations and doing stuff like that. I'm in the both and camp, as I said yesterday. Kingdom now, consummation later. And I don't like the term millennium because I think it's too small. Right? I can tell you this. My view of the eternal state is the kingdom on earth. Okay? I think they're one and the same. I think when the Lord returns and there's kingdom rule set on earth, that is never ending because it's a new heaven and a new earth. We don't need 1,000 years. 1,000 years would be a jip. Okay? It's like, what do you mean? 1,000 years? Is that all we get? Of course, the dispensationalists will say, no, then Satan's released, and there's this big battle, and then there's the eternal state. Well, that depends. Listen, that depends if you read Revelation linearly, chronologically. If you don't, that isn't what it looks like at all. We'll get to that in a moment, or sometime today. Luke 2.
We do have a question. We do have a question here.
Go ahead.
Two slides prior to that, is there any ambiguity in the commits iniquity, that, like in the translation, that it could be that iniquity is placed on Jesus and that could be Jesus?
Which verse?
2 slides back, where it says then he'll.
Oh, here, right here.
Yeah. Is there any translational kind of ambiguity that would say that could be not commits where he actually does it, but where it's placed on him?
Not that I'm aware of, but as we've already seen today with Psalm 68 and Ephesians 4, where in that case the wording was changed, the idea that you're describing, that the iniquity is placed upon him, is certainly clear in the Old Testament. I personally would think that idea comes from elsewhere, like Isaiah 53. But given that the New Testament writers do take thematic ideas from verses and then adapt the wording to the point they want to make, you could make that. What I would want to see is a clear citation of these elements here with that change to know that they were thinking of this passage. If you follow that. Okay. Again, just references here From now on, this is Luke 2. From now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. Is Jesus reigning or not? I mean, you can't look at passages like this and say no. Okay, so in some sense, the kingdom is now. That's the only point. Acts 5, God, our fathers raised Jesus, exalted him to the right hand. Well, he's exalted, but he's not really ruling. He's like just kind of exalted. Well, like, what does that mean? Okay, again, if you're going to push all the kingdom stuff to the future, you just have to say crazy things like that. Well, it's not a real rule. It's like I love this. It's a spiritual rule, meaning it's not real. It's not like happening in real time. Well, I'm sorry, but the last time I checked, I live in real time. And frankly, divine beings live in real time as well because they're created beings. I mean, they don't exist independent of any time at all. I mean, you can talk about the dimensional things and all that sort of stuff, but they are still subject to something. Only God is completely divorced from anything we associate with time and space and all that kind of thing. He's the only one who can act independently of it. Or Luke 1 or 3, whatever. If you find it, let me know, and then we'll tell everybody. Okay. Acts 7, again, the same. These are just references to Jesus at the right hand of God and reigning. 1 Peter 3, which we already saw.